Friday the 13th, Part 4, the final chapter. A fan novelization by Landon Turner. Chapter 5. Mom sure has been jumpy lately, Trish said to Tommy, sitting in the passenger seat, as she pulled the station wagon off the paved road onto the narrow dirt road that led to Crystal Lake. The old junkyard scrap of a car sputtered down the road, the sun shining down through the branches, casting shadows that danced across the windshield. "Yeah, I guess," Tommy said, petting Gordon, who stuck his head between the two from the back seat. Trish wondered if it was a midlife crisis. She was getting to that age. The age where you look back on life and question every decision you had ever made, and wonder how you ever got to where you were, and why you didn't take that one opportunity in college. That age scared the hell out of Trish. She wanted to go off to college and become a nurse, but with being homeschooled for a large part of her life, she feared that it would be too overwhelming, being thrown into a huge university with thousands of new people to meet. Maybe she could attend one of those smaller 2-year community colleges and take basic classes and then transfer to a larger 4-year college to get her degree. Then she could come back home until she got a job and made enough money to move out and maybe find someone to settle down with, squeeze out a few kids, and make a life for herself. Was that the life that she wanted? She had no idea. All she knew is that she had to get out of this town. Trish broke out of her thoughts when she heard shouting and joyous cries coming through the open rear window and saw the teenager's car parked on the side of the road. The shouting was coming from the lake. Gordon began to bark excitedly, and as Trish slowed down, squinting to see the lake through the trees, Gordon suddenly bounded through the open car window and disappeared into the woods. "Gordon, wait!" Tommy called. "Oh no, Gordon!" Trish exclaimed, bringing the car to an abrupt halt. Before Trish could think of what to do next, Tommy jumped out of the passenger seat, not closing the door behind him, and ran off into the woods after the dog. "Tommy!" Trish cried, and ran out of the car after him. Gordon bounded down the trail towards the lake, finally coming to a stop on the shore and barking excitedly at the throng of teenagers. "Hey, look, it's Gordon!" Paul shouted. Tommy came next, stumbling down the hillside, and stopped dead in his tracks beside Gordon. He looked out at the lake and his mouth dropped. The first thing he saw was the clothing littered all over the ground. Bras, panties, shirts, shorts, and shoes were scattered everywhere. He'd never heard of such a thing. Swimming naked? He thought that was only something people did in the movies. And then he saw Samantha come rising out of the water just enough to catch a glimpse of her breasts, and he felt his knees turn to jelly and the tingling feeling in his stomach. He had the urge to look away and to shield his eyes, but his 12-year-old boy mind wouldn't let him. "Oh my God," Trish thought, as she came running down the hillside, the realization hitting her. She didn't even know anyone actually skinny dipped. She thought it was just a thing someone talked about doing to sound cool. She was more naive than she had ever thought. Before Tommy could try to say something or pretend like he hadn't seen anything, Trish grabbed him firmly by both shoulders and spun him around. "Tommy, turn around right now!" Tommy tried to twist back towards the lake, but she held him in place. "Turn around," she ordered. "Hey, Trish!" "Come on in, Trish!" Paul called, gesturing her towards the water. She laughed nervously, trying to think of an excuse. "No, I think I'm overdressed," she said. It was the best thing she could think of. She didn't want them to see her face glowing bright red. "Bye!" She began to push Tommy back towards the trail, her other hand grabbing Gordon by the collar. "Party tonight, Trish! Hope to see you there!" Paul yelled. "Come on, Gordon. We're too young for this," Tommy sighed, walking with Trish towards the trail. Trish couldn't stop blushing the entire walk back to the car. "Some pack of patooties, huh?" Tommy said as they drove down the dirt road towards the house. "Tommy!" Trish said, flashing him a glare. She could just see the look on her mother's face when she told her that the kids next door had been skinny dipping, and she caught Tommy looking. That was just it. She wasn't planning on telling her. She may have a firm talk with Tommy herself later tonight about how spying on people was wrong, and maybe have the talk with him about girls. That's one of the reasons she wished her dad was still around. If she told Mrs. Jarvis about the whole ordeal, she would go ballistic. Mr. Jarvis would have calmly set Tommy down and gave him the old birds and the bees talk. Trish certainly wasn't good at relationships and the opposite sex herself, so what could she say? What advice could she possibly give? She hadn't been in a relationship since middle school, and all her mom would do was give Tommy an hour-long lecture and ground him from all of his video games. She remembered the glazed-over look in his eyes when they introduced themselves to those kids last night. Puberty was hitting him like a truck. Had she been that boy crazy when she hit puberty? She didn't think so. All she could remember was learning about her period and about things called tampons and why she would wake up covered in blood every now and then. And Trish was only 17. She was still going through the tail end of puberty as well. She barely knew anything about sex, only what she had managed to read about in magazines and from vague descriptions from her mom. She had no idea what to say to Tommy, so she just decided to keep quiet the rest of the ride home. What could she say? She hadn't even had a boyfriend since the 4th grade, and then it's not anything real. She really hadn't had a real relationship. There was nothing she could say to Tommy to get him to understand, but even she didn't understand it all that well. Plus, if she told her mom they had been skinny dipping, she didn't know how she would take it. She'd probably report them and get them kicked out by the landlord. And then, no party, and Trish wouldn't have even got to meet them all that well. It wouldn't hurt to go over and hang out for at least a little while. What was wrong with trying to be a normal teenager for once? Why couldn't her mother just lighten up? Maybe with Dad gone, she felt pressure to be the strict one and to be the one wearing the pants. Maybe her mom was just lonely and needed to get laid. It wouldn't kill Mom to get out and make some friends, Trish thought. She had been the one to opt to move to Crystal Lake after all, but Trish figured she hadn't anticipated the townsfolk to be so aloof. It was like the land around them was cursed. People gave her funny looks when she mentioned that she lived out on the lake. It was almost like anyone who dared come out to the lake was some kind of lunatic. But of course, it made sense with all the stories she had heard. Awful stuff had happened out here, according to the locals. But then again, small towns always engage in hearsay and rumors that eventually get out of hand. Camp Blood, the locals would say. You actually live out by Camp Blood? Whatever had happened, if it had happened, had really spooked them and turned them into a very superstitious bunch. At least these kids renting the vacation home seemed fairly normal, and it was probably because they weren't from Crystal Lake. Trish was broken out of her thoughts for the second time by the car's engine jolting, sputtering noisily and slowing to a stop. Another raucous clattering came from the engine, and then the car stalled. "Great, what's next?" Trish exclaimed. "I'll take a look," Tommy said, climbing out of the car and walking around to the hood. One of the things their dad did manage to do is teach Tommy all about cars. At 5, he was walking around talking about carburetors and fan belts, and by the time he was 10, he could replace a flat tire. Tommy popped open the hood and stuck his head into the engine compartment. "Can you fix it?" Trish asked after about a minute of silence. Tommy stuck his head from behind the open hood. "I need a screwdriver," he said. "There may be one in the trunk," she replied, handing him the keys. He walked around the trunk, unlocked it, and popped it open, scanning the cluttered interior. No screwdriver," Trish sighed. "Oh, great. Looks like we're walking." "You guys need some help?" said a voice. Trish turned her head to the passenger side window and gasped with fright as she saw a stranger leaning into the car. He was a tall, rugged man in his early 20s with a head of wavy black hair, a young, scrubbed-clean face, and wearing a flannel shirt, jeans, and hiking boots. He carried a big travel duffel bag and a rolled-up sleeping bag that was slung over his right shoulder. He looked like he could be on one of those survivalist shows. "Hi, I'm Rob Dyer. Sorry, didn't mean to scare you," he said with a warm, apologetic expression. Trish stepped out of the car apprehensively and waited for him to walk around to her side. He extended his hand. "Hello, I'm Trish Jarvis, and this is my brother Tommy," she said, hesitant about introducing herself to a random man who approached them in the woods, but he seemed friendly enough. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked. "It won't start," Trish said, gesturing to the car. Rob pulled off his backpack, set it on the roof of the car, and rubbed his hands together. "Let's see what I can do. Get in, give it a crank when I tell you." Trish nodded in response and climbed into the driver's seat. Rob bent down underneath the hood and reached a hand down behind the engine. I think the problem is the celluloid, but we don't have a screwdriver to fix it, Tommy said. Rob whipped out a Bowie knife and gave Tommy a look. He placed it strategically between two wires, creating a shower of sparks. "Try it now," he said. Trish twisted the key in the ignition, and the car roared to life. With a relieved sigh, she leaned her head out the window. "You need a lift?" Rob shrugged. "Sure, why not? Where are you headed?" "Back to the house. We live right down the road. You can have dinner with us," Trish said, smiling. Her mother probably wouldn't appreciate a random stranger joining in on their family meal, but after he saved them the good 15-minute walk in the summer heat, it would have been to the house. It was the least she could do. "Sounds fantastic," Rob said, and grabbed his backpack. He climbed into the passenger seat as Tommy slid into the back seat beside Gordon, and Trish started off down the road. "I didn't think anyone lived this deep in the woods," Rob said. "We do," Trish replied. "What are you doing out here in our neck of the woods?" "Hunting for bear," he said. "You can't be hunting for bear," Tommy said with a frown. Rob changed the subject hurriedly. Are there any kids around here? Vacationers, people like that?" Rob asked. "Yeah, a bunch of kids moved in yesterday right next door to us." "How far is Crystal Lake from here?" Rob asked. "Oh, we live on the lake." "Really? Great, that's where I'm headed." The trees cleared as the Jarvis house came into view, perched on a small slope. The rental house in view a few hundred yards away, a narrow dirt path between the two. Trish pulled the car to a stop in front of the house and parked. "Here we are," Trish said. "Thanks for the lift," Rob said. "Are you going to come in?" Trish asked. If her mother had a problem with it, she could get over it. Maybe she finally had a friend. "No, I don't think I can," Rob replied, looking towards the lake. "Oh, you gotta come in," Tommy chimed in from the back seat. "There's something real neat I want to show you up in my room." As the three began to walk towards the house, Trish began to grow worried. Should she be taking this complete stranger into her house? She didn't know where he was from or what he was doing out here in the middle of nowhere. After all, he said he was hunting for bear, and there weren't any bears in this part of the country. What could go wrong? He seemed like a nice guy, and he looked like he needed a quick shower and some food. Her mother should be glad to do such a hospitable thing as helping him on his way. It was the least they could do for him, starting up their car for them. Maybe he just didn't know that there weren't any bears in this part of the country. Yeah, that had to be it. Rob, Trish, and Tommy got out of the car and walked up to the front porch as Mrs. Jarvis opened the front door. Her eyebrows furrowed with confusion, and she looked at Trish with a "who the hell is this" look. "Mom, this is Rob," she said, gesturing to Rob. "Rob, this is my mother." Rob extended his hand and gave the best polite smile. "Hi, Rob Dyer. Nice to meet you, Mrs. Jarvis," her mother said, shaking his hand nervously. "Come on, Rob, you gotta see my room," Tommy exclaimed, dragging Rob into the house and up the staircase by the hand like a dog on a leash. Trish stepped into the house, closed the door, and as she turned around she was greeted by the same look from her mother. "Who's your friend?" she asked before Trish could utter a word. "He's a guy we picked up. He fixed our car. I thought he could have dinner with us," she answered. Mrs. Jarvis looked bewildered. "Okay, well, I guess I'll start fixing it," she said, looking nervously towards the staircase and heading for the kitchen. Trish let out a deep breath. She took that surprisingly well. Maybe she was just in a good mood. Normally, she would have pulled her aside and gave her a stern talk and probably forced her guest to leave. Upstairs, Tommy pushed open the door to his room, and Rob's jaw dropped in astonishment at the assortment of masks hanging from the ceiling. The room was some amalgamation of sci-fi conventions and horror movie sets, complete with posters and memorabilia of all different forms. Rob toyed with one of the action figures on the bookshelf, taking it all in, as Tommy stood in the middle of the room, his hands on his hips, proud of his work. "Cool, huh?" he said. "Amazing," Rob muttered, spinning one of his masks around on its string. Hold on, here's my latest mask," Tommy said, lifting up a large head made of foam. He put it on his head, and his hand operated a remote. It was a Planet of the Apes-esque monkey head replica, complete with an open mouth full of razor-sharp fangs. Each time Tommy pushed a varying order of buttons on the remote, The mask would move and contort to resemble realistic facial motions. The mechanisms rippled underneath the leathery layer of artificial skin. Rawr! Tommy made the best guttural monster sound he could. Wait, you made this? Rob asked, dumbfounded. Yeah, Tommy replied, taking off the mask. You're talented, kid, Rob said, studying each of the masks. It was better than anything he could have ever done. They all looked so realistic, so professional, like something right out of a Hollywood studio. Thanks, Tommy said. As Rob glanced out the window, he saw the rental house on the opposite side of the clearing, and the car sitting out front. It was perfect. He could stay here and keep an eye on those kids at the same time. He was looking for someone, and those kids would lead him straight to that someone that he had been hunting for the past 4 days. Tonight, Rob had business to attend to. Midnight swim. Nighttime had fallen over Crystal Lake. The moon set low in the sky, glowing like a beacon just above the top of the wall of pine trees that surrounded the lake, its reflection shimmering on the surface of the water. It seemed as though nothing could disturb the eerie peace of the slowly approaching darkness. The only other sounds were the chirping of crickets, the soft approach of thunder in the distance, and the faint music coming from inside the rental house. The teenagers' get-together was just kicking off. The guys had gone into town and picked up tons of food and beer while the girls stayed to spruce the place up a bit. The girls all showered and changed into party dresses and more comfortable attire from their time at the lake, and the guys were in their best shirts and slacks. Ted had searched through the stacks of vintage records and picked out a few selections for the music. Love Is a Lie by Lion was blaring through the turntable. Jimmy popped the collar of his blue suede shirt and leaned against the doorframe, watching Doug and Sarah curled up on the sofa, and Sam and Paul making out on the staircase, and sighed heavily. Tina and Terry were on the other sofa, whispering excitedly and giggling at him. Just ask one of them to dance, Jimmy urged himself. He watched nervously, trying and not succeeding to act nonchalant as he paced back and forth around the room, checking his hair in the mirror as he walked by. Damn Ted and his bullshit, he thought. They had made a bet when they were out getting beer that he could get one of the twins in bed before Ted. Jimmy was starting to fear he might lose $20. Damn you, Ted. Damn you for putting this dead fuck thing in my head, he thought. Now he was having all kinds of doubts. What if she laughed in his face? What if everyone would get laid at this party tonight except for him? What if Ted was right? What if he actually was hopeless in bed and truly a dead fuck? He just needed a little confidence, he thought to himself, puffing out his chest suddenly. His dad had always told him as long as you were confident in being yourself, no girl could resist. Maybe it was finally time to start listening to someone else rather than Ted. After all, what the hell did Ted know? He wasn't even dating anyone. He never held down a girl for more than a few weeks at the most. He always claimed that he couldn't be wasting his time being tied down to one girl, that he was always on the move and on the lookout for new sex and for new experiences. Then again, Ted was not the guy to go to for love advice. How to get laid quick? Sure, but not for true advice on love and women. Jimmy eventually wanted something real, and Ted wouldn't know real if it hit him in the face. But now he didn't care about anything real, and he was hornier than ever. He finally took a deep breath and walked casually over towards the couch. Would either of you care to dance? He asked the twins, extending his hand. Terry looked at Tina with a coy smile and then back at Jimmy. To this song? She asked, hearing the boisterous rock music coming through the turntable in the corner. This is good, Jimmy said. Terry hesitated. Sure, she said, and took his hand. Jimmy led her to the center of the room, and they both began moving to the beat. Terry couldn't help but snicker at his awkward but endearing dancing. He was honestly kind of cute, but as she glanced over at Doug and Sarah, she felt herself getting sick with envy. Doug could do so much better than her, she thought, yet here she was settling for Jimmy. Then again, the night was still young. If everyone would loosen up a little and maybe get a little hammered, then this party just may get more interesting. Maybe the boys would come to their senses and figure out that they were the only girls worth screwing tonight. God, that was real bitchy of me, Terry thought to herself. She couldn't help it. At Crystal Lake High, her and Tina were always the hottest and most popular girls at any party. And parties in Crystal Lake weren't that hard to come by if you knew just how boring of a town it truly was. At Crystal Lake High, both of them had to swat guys off like flies drawn to flypaper. Everywhere they went, they were always being hit on, either by the football coach or the creepy guy that was always hanging out and asking for money down at the old gas station. And now the two hottest guys at the party were taken by a total sleaze and a flat-chested nobody. The only other two guys to fuck was Jimmy and his spastic dancing, and the total Elvis wannabe who had walked into the living room and was now drooling all over Tina. "Come on, give the old teddy bear a kiss," Ted said into Tina's ear, and she pushed him away. He held up a teddy bear he had grabbed off the curio cabinet and held it up to her, kissing her with it, and then he tossed the teddy bear aside, brought his lips up to hers, and pressed hard. Tina turned her head as his wet lips made their way across her cheek and onto her neck. She managed to push him away, and a tight smile formed across her lips. "I need another drink," she said, her eyes glaring at him. She gave Terry a glance, stood up, and walked into the kitchen, as Ted slumped on the couch rejected. Terry kept dancing to the turntable with Jimmy, who was still thrashing wildly in an attempt to impress her, and it wasn't working all that well. Then again, he was sort of cute, and he wouldn't be the ugliest guy she had had sex with. Maybe I can pull that bimbo off of Paul and take him upstairs and show him what sex with a real woman is like, Terry thought. She hated to think things like that, but she couldn't help herself when Paul looked the way he did. His wavy dark hair and his tan skin was almost too much to bear. He was way hotter than any guys from Crystal Lake. "I am such a bitch," she thought again. That was always how hard it had been her entire life. That's how they were known around Crystal Lake High. Tina was the slut, Terry was the bitch. At least Terry got along with her sister for the most part. Terry had always been a mother to Tina, even though she was only about 5 seconds older. She made sure that she was being safe, having sex responsibly, and not risking getting STDs or worse, getting pregnant. Their mom died when they were little, and so all they had was their dad, who just sat around the house for the better part of his day, knocking back bottles of scotch and cigars and cursing at them every chance he got. Sure, maybe she wouldn't be as much of a bitch if she didn't have to deal with all the anger inside at her asshole of a dad, but what could she do? Everybody dealt with their demons in their own way. She dealt with them with bitchiness, and Tina dealt with her frustration by fucking every guy she met. Just then the loud rock music died, and Frank Sinatra's soft jazz rendition of Tangerine began to play. "Hey, why'd you change it?" Jimmy asked Paul, who was switching out the records at the turntable. "Relax, Jimbo. Your girl's gonna love this one," Paul said, and walked over to Samantha, who wrapped her arms around his waist and gently swayed with him, burying her head in his chest. Jimmy glanced awkwardly at Terry and laughed, offering her a slow dance. "Why not?" she said, and wrapped her arms around his neck as they began to slowly sway from side to side. Tina watched broodingly, staring at Paul and Samantha slow dancing by the turntable, and frowned. "I could have him falling all over me," Tina thought. Sam whispered something into Paul's ear and suddenly took off for the kitchen, leaving him alone. Now was her chance. That Selma Hayek wannabe is way over her head, she thought. What he needs is a woman, not a girl. Tina took a quick glance into the mirror on the wall, fixed her hair and checked her teeth, and walked over to Paul seductively, putting on her best sexy look. "You like this stuff?" she asked, about the soft jazz humming through the brass phone of the record player. "Yeah," he said. "You like slow dancing?" she asked flirtatiously, pushing up closer to him. Samantha walked back into the room, holding a beer. She saw Tina and Paul by the record player, and her eyes narrowed. What did that bitch think she was doing? Sam thought, seeing the glazed look in her eye as she stared up at Paul. It was the same look she gave Paul whenever she wanted to get it on with him. Samantha made a wry face and hurried over, stepping in front of Tina and throwing her hands around Paul's neck dramatically. "Kiss me, you fool!" she exclaimed, a la Olive Oil. Paul yanked her into his arms. "Certainly," he exclaimed, imitating Popeye, and kissed her playfully, resulting in loud, high-pitched laughter from Sam, who snuck Tina a dirty glare out of the corner of her eye. Tina gave her an equally nasty look back and sauntered over to Ted sitting on the couch. "Want to dance?" she asked reluctantly. Maybe seeing her with Ted would make Paul jealous, and he'd finally see what she could do for him. Ted jumped to his feet like a dog hearing his name. "Let Teddy Bear show you how it's done," Ted said, and the night went on, everyone oblivious to the man in the hockey mask right outside the window, watching them. Trish and Rob stepped out of the front door and closed it, embracing the warm brush of the night breeze coming in from the lake and listening to the soft singing of crickets and owls hooting in the trees. "Well, your mother's an amazing cook," Rob said, lifting his backpack higher on his shoulder. "Yeah, since our dad's not around, she had to adapt. She used to hate it," Trish answered, walking down the path towards the road with him. "So it's just the three of you out here?" Rob asked. "Yeah. My parents are separated. You know, middle-aged crazy," Trish sighed. "I kinda hope that they get back together." "I hope so, too," Rob said sympathetically. There was a moment of awkward silence as his eyes met hers, and she felt herself blushing. "Say something," Trish prodded herself. "Don't just walk in silence." Looks like another rainy one," she said, staring up at the dark clouds that were beginning to cover the stars. Nice going, she thought, real smooth. "Yeah," he replied, glancing at the sky. They both heard the low rumble of thunder approaching and stared out into the night. Trish glanced at him out of the corner of her eye and noticed his hard stare, as if his eyes were transfixed on something out there in the woods, watching them. What was his deal? There had to be something that he wasn't telling her. His gaze was always out of focus, as if his mind was constantly elsewhere. And at the dinner table, he had dodged their questions and kept glancing out the window and avoiding eye contact. Something was definitely bothering him, and she wanted to know what. Why did he have to be so alluring? It was something about the years that he had had on her. She had never had a thing for older men, but now she just couldn't help herself with him. She was definitely physically attracted to him. But then again, she also found him psychologically captivating too. He was stoic and mysterious, but she could tell there was probably a much softer side of him in the way that he looked at her. It was like he was trying to tell her something important, but never doing it. What was he hiding? She decided not to pry as she glanced out at the night and then back at Rob. "Listen, if it ever gets too bad out there, or you just need to take a shower, we're always at home, and if we're not, Tommy usually leaves the door open," Trish said. If anything happened out there, she wanted him to know that he had a place to come for help. Rob nodded in understanding. "Just stay on the trail. It leads around the lake," Trish explained, pointing off down the path. "Thanks," he said. Without warning, he leaned down and kissed her on the cheek, and after a soft brush of his hands on hers, he walked off into the night towards the lake. Trish watched him leave, feeling her heart flutter and the flesh of her cheeks turning beet red. He was definitely older than her, probably in his late 20s, but her parents had been 10 years apart, and when did age become some kind of impossible barrier to overcome? As she walked back towards the house, she began to wonder about his body, picturing him naked under those dirty clothes, imagining the feeling of his warm body on hers, moving with her, inside her. "What are you doing, Trish?" she thought. "You picked this guy up on the road in your car, and now you were having fantasies about him?" "You're being ridiculous," she laughed at herself. She was actually fawning over a guy much older than her that she had just met who could be some kind of maniac. "That's what happens, Mom, when you keep your daughter cooped up for so long. She gets so damn horny that she wants to have wild sex with every strange man that she runs into in the woods." But something about him was so mysterious and alluring. She also couldn't stop thinking about why he was out here. He had blatantly lied when he had told Tommy and her that he was hunting bear. At the dinner table, he had also changed his story and said that he was doing a survey of the lake's wildlife, after Tommy hammered him about there being no bears at Crystal Lake. What in the world was he really doing out here? It wasn't often that she saw people camping here, especially with how the locals felt about the lake. Then again, Rob didn't seem like the woodsman type when it came down to it. He was carrying all the right equipment with his thick flannel shirt, jeans, and hiking boots, and his gigantic knapsack, and the knife in the leather sheath on his belt, but his personality didn't fit. He seemed like too much of a city boy. He was probably just out here for a vacation, but why the wild stories about bears? She didn't know, but she had an uneasy feeling about him. Trish walked back inside the house and closed the door. She went through the living room and into the kitchen where Mrs. Jarvis was at the kitchen sink, scrubbing a casserole dish clean. "Well, he was nice," Mrs. Jarvis said, seeing Trish out of the corner of her eye. "But promise me you won't bring home any more strangers." Trish smiled. "I promise." "But he did get the car fixed," she said, sitting on a bar stool. "You did a nice thing, but he could have been a maniac," Mrs. Jarvis said. She turned to Trish, hesitated, and then said, "I just want you and Tommy to be safe." "I know, but," Trish started to say. "No, just listen," Mrs. Jarvis interrupted, her eyes filled with concern. "There's something I haven't told you and Tommy because I didn't want you to be scared, but there's some bad stuff going on." "What?" Trish asked, her voice sounding worried. Mrs. Jarvis hesitated longer, deciding whether or not to tell her about the murders. "Some kids got killed up near the camp," she finally said. Trish's eyes widened. "The news said it was bad. They were killed by a psycho living in the woods. You see how unsafe it can be to just let someone into our home?" "Oh, I'm sorry, I had no idea. Did they catch him?" Trish asked. "He's dead. They killed him, but it just goes to show that you can't trust people nowadays. Some people are really sick," Mrs. Jarvis said. Had Trish heard her mother right? Killed? As in murdered? She shuddered down to the soles of her feet. "Just be careful, all right?" her mother said, interrupting her thoughts. Trish nodded after a pause. "I will." "How you doing with Terry?" Ted asked Jimmy, who was leaning against the kitchen counter. Jimmy didn't answer, pretending to ignore him and staring sadly into his beer. "Nowhere, huh?" Ted said, shaking his head. "She hates me, Ted," Jimmy said morosely. "Look, Jimbo, you gotta warm her up first." "I don't need any of your advice, Ted," Jimmy rebuffed. "Look, just do what I do," Ted started to say. Jimmy watched as Ted stuck his hand in his pants, unzipped his zipper with the other, and stuck his pointer finger through the zipper of his jeans, wagging it at Jimmy. "Now don't be such a dead fuck," Ted said, guffawing with laughter at his own joke. Jimmy slammed his hand on the counter. "Look, Ted, I told you I didn't like that. Besides, you have the hot one of the two." Jimmy sighed with frustration. His eyes grew wide as Tina stepped into the room. Ted still had his hand in his pants, his finger poking through his open zipper, cracking up at his charade, not noticing Tina standing there with a wry look on her face. Jimmy swatted him, and Ted turned to see Tina standing in the doorway. Ted laughed nervously. "Hiya," he said, waving with his hand that was poking through his zipper. "He thinks that's funny. He thinks that's a funny thing he's doing," Jimmy said. Tina stifled a giggle, grabbed a beer from the counter, and walked back into the living room. "Great. Now you ruined it for me with her, too," Jimmy sighed, walking back into the living room. Ted reached out and grabbed him, pulling him back. "Hey, Jimbo, I'm trying to help you out," Ted protested. But Jimmy knocked his hand away and walked out of the room. Back in the main room, the party was livening up as Paul motioned everyone to all gather around. The teens gathered around the living room, Tina and Terry standing in the center of the misshapen circle they had formed. Paul punched a hole through the bottom of 2 cans of Budweiser with a corkscrew, fizz bubbling to his lips as he sipped it up. He handed 1 beer can to Tina and 1 to Terry. "All right, the first one to chug wins," Paul said. "You ready, girls?" Tina and Terry both nodded, giggling with excitement, bringing the cans up to their lips. "Okay, on 3, said Paul. 1, 2, 3, the group chanted. Tina and Terry both tilted their head back, guzzling beer as fast as they could, most of it ending up on the floor. The teenagers urged on both girls, laughing and cheering boisterously. After a minute of drinking and chaos, Tina finished and lifted her beer can in the air in victory. Terry fell back into a chair, defeated, laughing hysterically. "The winner is Tina!" Paul shouted as the group cheered exuberantly, all except for Samantha, who watched as Tina leapt into Paul's arms, hugging him for longer than she was comfortable with. "What do I win?" Tina said to Paul, biting her lip coyly. "What do you want?" Paul asked. "How about a dance?" Paul smiled. Samantha's jaw dropped. "Jimbo, put on another record." Paul pointed to the turntable and pulled Tina close. Jimmy picked up a record and put it on the turntable. Stella by Starlight poured into the room softly as Tina draped her arms around Paul's neck and they gently swayed back and forth, Paul's hands on her hips. Tina caught Sam giving Paul an icy stare. "Oh, you don't mind, do you?" Tina asked with a bitchy smirk. Samantha watched as she leaned her head on Paul's shoulder. Her arms were crossed tightly, her eyes staring daggers. "Actually, I'm going to take a swim. It's getting a bit too close in here for me," Sam said coldly, and stormed out of the house, banging the front door closed after her. Sarah moved for the door, concerned. "Sam, wait!" Sarah called after her, but Doug grabbed her hand and pulled her back towards him. Sarah, let's just dance," Doug said. "I don't want to dance," Sarah protested. "Let's just mind our own business," Doug said. "I'll talk to Paul tonight, all right?" Sarah sighed, not taking her eyes off the door. She turned back to Doug. "All right." She gave in and leaned into him, still thinking about how angry Samantha looked. They never should have brought these strangers to this party. Really, Sam and Sarah had talked before the party, and it was actually only the guys' decision to bring them. The girls never got a say in it. Sarah had seen Tina making eyes at Doug the entire night, too. She knew it was a matter of time before something like this happened. But Doug was right. Just let Sam and Paul work this out on their own, she told herself. The teens had much bigger things to worry about. "That bitch," Samantha thought nastily as she walked down the trail towards the lake. "She just shows up at our party with her just as slutty sister and ruins everything. God damn it!" Sam had warned Paul that she didn't have a good feeling about them, but he didn't listen. Men never listen. Sometimes their dick could really get in the way of them actually thinking sensibly. Why even invite total strangers? What can go wrong? Paul had said, and now she knew he had just been after the sex. She stopped and took a deep breath, the burning sensation in her chest slowly fading. That bitch, she thought again. That bitch. She wanted to rip them apart with her bare hands. She wanted to hit her as hard as she could with one of those wine bottles on the wall. But that's how a guy would have done it, and she wasn't about to stoop down to that level. Girls didn't fight like that. They did it all in secret. God, she had been all over him. They almost had to mop up her drool. Wasn't there some kind of secret code for women? If there was, the first rule should be never go after a taken man. It just wasn't right. Shouldn't women look out for each other? Shouldn't women never go after another woman's man? I would never do anything like that, Sam said. Sure, she was promiscuous, but never a homewrecker or a cheater. It just wasn't right. Of course, Tina wasn't the only one to blame. Paul was just letting it happen. She wasn't really as hurt about Tina, but she was more hurt that Paul didn't stop her. Nobody tried to stop her. They just let her practically molest him in there. Paul didn't do a damn thing to stop her or reject her. He had a fucking girlfriend. Why didn't he tell her no? Was it that hard to resist someone's sexual advances for a guy? For her, it was easy. Whenever some creep hit on her at a party, all she did was tell him that she had a man, and that was that. For some reason, guys just couldn't keep it in their pants. All she needed was a nice dip in the lake to just clear her head and cool off. She still felt disgusted seeing them all over each other. She was still sweating and shaking from almost punching that skank. Maybe Paul would come to his senses and join her. Samantha shivered as a cold breeze brushed her bare arm. It was getting colder by the minute. She continued down the winding trail, hugging her arms to her chest, still shaking her head in anger. She still pictured them pressed up against each other. That bitch, she thought again, repeating it over and over again in her head, until in some kind of strange therapeutic way it made her feel better. She knew that something was up when they met the two of them on the trail earlier. Paul had that look in his eye, the same look that he had had when he had come on to her 100 times before. He probably led her on, she thought. He was practically panting like a dog in heat over her. All the guys were. She even caught Doug staring at Tina's ass when they were swimming, but she didn't tell Sarah. Sam could take something like this happening. She was pissed, sure, but Sam had had guys cheat on her before. Sarah? Sarah had only ever dated Doug. She would have been devastated. That slut can take Paul, but if she so much as touches Doug and hurts her best friend, she would have hell to pay. Sam could make out the sign that read Crystal Point through the darkness and stepped onto the sandy shore. The lake looked eerily calm. A white mist hung over the surface of the water like an oppressive cloud. The night was quiet and still, all except for owls and crickets and the gentle lapping of the water onto the shore. She shivered, glancing around, making sure nobody was watching, and stripped down to her underwear and then nude. Just then a twig snapped. She whirled around towards the trail, covering her bare chest with her hands. "Paul?" No response. "I know you're out there, Paul," she called into the darkness. She let her hands fall to her side, revealing her naked body to whoever was out there. "Hey, Paul, this is what you're missing," she yelled bitterly. Still no answer. Just like men to just take everything for granted, she thought. "Fine, screw you, Paul," she cried, and turned back towards the lake. She squinted, barely able to make out an inflatable yellow raft floating out in the middle of the lake. They must have forgotten it on the shore this afternoon, and it got swept out into the water. Samantha stuck her toe in the water, and after deciding that it was bearable, she dove into the water, paddling towards the raft. She grabbed hold of the rubber grips on the side of the raft and pulled her body up onto it, sprawling out on her stomach. How dare Paul be all over some white trash backwoods bitches when he can have all of this? That was the thing with men. When they're trying to get with you, they're sweet and kind and opening doors for you. When they actually get you to go out with them and be their girlfriend and fuck them, they don't want anything else to do with you. And they just want to move on to the next best thing. They were all disgusting. Maybe she'd get back at him and go screw around with Ted or Jimmy. They were kind of cute. Or maybe she would just grab a bottle of tequila and get shit-faced or smoke some of Ted's grass. Either way, Paul was going to have to do a lot of apologizing. He would probably be out here in no time, on his knees begging for forgiveness. Crack. Another twig snapping on shore caught her attention. She looked up towards the dock and thought she saw some bushes moving. "Paul? Paul?" she called. No answer. "I know you're out there, Paul." Still no response. This is what Sam always did when she got pissed, and Paul would always eventually come find her and win her back. It was just a matter of time. "Screw you, Paul," she called out into the darkness. Some fucking graduation, she thought miserably. She sprawled back onto the rubber raft, trying to ignore the cold water seeping through the bottom. And then she heard something else, water splashing, like someone was coming through the water towards her. She didn't have time to look up to see who it was, because just as a huge splash of water came over her, a gigantic, meaty hand clamped down on the back of her head, pinning her to the raft. Sam screamed as loud as she could, trying to fight against the hand on the nape of her neck, but it was too powerful. She twisted her head around underneath the monstrous hand, just enough to see the white goalie mask that the huge man leaning into the raft and pinning her down was wearing. There was a loud thunk and a hiss of air as something penetrated the bottom of the raft, and Sam felt a searing hot pain like nothing she had ever felt before in her abdomen. She felt cold steel rip through her torso, and as she let out a guttural shriek, her life began to slip away. The tip of the hunting knife poked through the tender flesh of her back, crimson rivulets of blood cascading down her bare ass and pooling in the bottom of the raft around her, as her screaming and convulsing came to a sudden stop. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been Chapter 5 of Friday the 13th 4, the final chapter, a fan novelization by Landon Turner. Be sure to thank Landon in the comments section for making this book available, for writing it so we have a novelization for this movie. Otherwise, we would already be done with all the Friday the 13th books on the channel. And if anybody out there knows of any fan books for 5, 6, 7, 8, Jason Goes to Hell, or if you want to write one yourself, I will narrate it here on the channel. Really enjoying what he's doing with the characters, giving us a deeper dive into Trish, Tommy, Rob, the twins, the Double Mint twins. It's a lot of fun, and I thought the way he handled the death scene there with Samantha was a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to seeing how he's going to handle certain things that are coming up in the book, things the movie kind of glazed over. Maybe he expanded on them, and I'm really excited about that, and I'll be back very soon with more of Friday the 13th 4, the final chapter by Landon Turner. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood slasher librarian saying thanks for listening, be excellent to each other, and I'll see you soon.